What's up guys? Now finally got round to looking at a car that I've been looking forward to seeing in detail from the moment I saw it on a tiny picture on my mobile phone when I was on a train yesterday. And at that point I saw the picture of the front wing on this Alfa Romeo Racing car and was like, wow, you know, that is different. And I love innovation. I love something different in Formula One. I think I misinterpreted it at that point as well, thinking it was, I think I misinterpreted the angle of this flap. A big flap on the front wing there on the tiny picture, and thought it was all about massive inwash. It's not quite like that. There is inwash effect, of course, from this, but actually it's an extreme version or extreme way, extreme solution of recreating that massive outwash effect that they lost from last year's cars. So I love it already. It's already my favourite F1 car just because of the technical detail and the innovation detail that's on it. It came in that fantastic livery as well, didn't it? We think it's just a one-off livery, and when it comes to testing next week in Barcelona, it'll be back to some kind of standard, whatever that is, for Alfa Romeo. The car's not actually been launched yet. It gets launched on Monday, and so the caveat we have to say here is that this is a shakedown, a leaked shakedown picture, and what we don't know is what the car was doing on track at that point. Were they just throwing this on as a wild experiment? You know, we don't know how, you know, what the testing program was at this point. It was a filming shakedown. So that's the caveat. We'll find out more when it's officially launched on Monday and we see it heading around the track. But having looked into what the concept is here, I can very much see this being the way or the direction that Alfa Romeo are looking to go. So let's get into it. Let's have a little look at some of the intricacies of this fantastic car. Now the front wing is the first thing that stands out as being different. Striking in that the front wing doesn't use anywhere near the maximum allowed space, if you like, for bodywork, for wing sections. Now most other teams have started to use that. Mercedes, certainly, Red Bull have used all of the available space, generating huge downforce and using all of the areas of that bodywork or that wing section to control the airflow in ways that they want it to be controlled around the car. What Alfa Romeo have done, a little bit like what Renault did and a little bit like what Ferrari have done, although a more extreme version than both of those, is only really use the inboard section of these flaps, these upper flaps here, for bodywork, for pieces of the wing. As you can clearly see, the outboard section tapers away to pretty much nothing, leaving this big gap between the end plate through to the outside of the tyre. Now the concept behind this is trying to drive the airflow through that gap and create this big outwash effect that'll go out past the tyre. You've got to think about airflow as a fluid. In science terms, we call airflow, we call air a fluid. It behaves in the same way. And if you think about a fluid, you think about the way that rivers run through mountains. They take the path of least resistance and worm their way through a mountain or a stream, doesn't it? It takes the path of least resistance, and airflow is exactly the same. So by angling, by tapering this away, and leaving this great big gap here, funneled in between these flaps here and the end plate, you're leaving the path of least resistance directly out through that rearward corner of the end plate. So that is exactly the channel that the airflow is going to follow. Now what that's going to do, of course, aided by the little flip out, the slight curvature on the front wing end plate, is of course going to force that airflow right out past the tyre, dragging away with it the messy, turbulent tyre weight that we keep talking about, that's so disruptive for an aerodynamicist. If we can pull that away from the car, we don't have to deal with it further downstream. It doesn't interfere with the other areas of sensitive bodywork and the floor section that are going to be there to generate downforce for us. So by getting rid of it at this point, it's really beneficial, and that's what everything last year was designed around. These really complex, really heavily curved and arced front wing end plates were all about pulling that wake away from the car. Because we've lost that in the regs now, this is an extreme take on how we might start to recover some of that. Now you can see, as I said, from the way that Renault have designed theirs and Ferrari have designed theirs, that the concept is one that has been thought about up and down the pit lane. This is just going to the absolute extreme lengths of that. Moving inboard then, we can also see that they have joined together the two upper flaps here. So we're only allowed 5 elements in a wing. The upper 2 here have been joined together as one big solid piece. And I think what that's all about there is because they have lost so much bodywork in this section, I think they're using this to generate downforce, to claw back some of the downforce they might have lost by removing some of the other parts of the furniture on the end of the wing, if you like. Each of these slots here, the slotted parts of the wing, it's not really about generating too much downforce. The slots allow airflow, of course, to bleed through there, and it's much more about control. But by joining them together, by creating a larger surface area and a much more angled and profiled wing section here, actually that element there will be generating downforce. So perhaps to kind of compensate for the loss of surface area on the outboard edge. Raised up in the middle, like we've seen on the Renault, for example. Again, each of the elements tailing in towards the middle to create that wing-tip vortex spiralling off there that's passed down the side of the chassis and managed by the barge boards. So that section is sort of relatively what we might say is standard at this point. A very, very flat front wing main plane. Now that again is about generating downforce. Slightly turned up, of course, at the end to aid that outwash towards the front wing end plate. But that's a section of wing that's generating downforce, or compensating again for the loss of downforce that we might have otherwise had if we'd had all of the allowable area being utilised on the front wing. So that's really interesting. The nose cone, a little bit McLaren-esque, isn't it, with the triple nostril arrangement. I spoke about that earlier, about these openings here being designed to just shovel airflow through the middle of there and be worked by the underside of the nose cone, underside of the chassis. Getting as much airflow into there as possible is absolutely key, and that's what they've done here. And I imagine, I can't see from these pictures where there must be an intake for this big S-duct up here. It may well be fed by one of these ducts, or it may have another duct on the underside or the side of the nose cone. We won't see that until we see proper pictures on Monday, I guess. But the S-duct opening here is particularly large and particularly deep. There's almost a great big trough, almost a huge duct filling all of this section up here just to aid the attachment of the airflow along the top of the chassis. So really, really interesting front end. One of the things that puzzles me, or one of the questions I would immediately have about this, is that without all of these control, flow control elements on the outboard side of the wing there, you are under the influence, or you come up against potential problems as the front wheels start to turn. Because at this point, of course, you can clearly see there's a gap. The wheels are in a more or less straight ahead position. They're not, you know, we know the width of a front wheel. But of course, as it turns, the shape of that wheel completely changes. And that, in turn, affects massively the aerodynamics of this area. It will change the effective gap between the end plate and the tyre itself. And those things, you know, I'm sure they've thought about it, but I'm sure but those things are questions that would immediately leap to my mind as to how they manage that through the different conditions that the front wheels find themselves in around a lap. This is just a shot from a slightly different angle where you can really see the gap and the outwards curvature of the end plate, all designed to pull the airflow through that path of least resistance, straight through that gap and away from the front tyre. So just another way of seeing it. Again, you can see the great big trough-like S-duct opening here with the pitot. That's a pitot tube measuring airspeed and air pressure at the top of the chassis there. One of the things you can see from this picture is that their suspension arrangement is a little bit like that of Mercedes, where they have this front upper wishbone raised up on this kind of stalk. Let me get my pointy pen out. This stalk, on the inboard edge, this stalk is mounted to the top of the upright. It then protrudes out and upwards to allow the front wishbone to be raised up higher. But what it also does is that this element, this mounting bracket here, can be shaped in an aerodynamic form. So it is also part of the aerodynamic control that controls airflow that will then move around the front tyre. So it has a double benefit at that point. But again, a bit like Mercedes, they've opted to raise up the suspension at the front as high as possible to generate the cleaner or freer stream of air through the middle of that lot to get to the inlet ducts further back. You can also see on this picture the overhead air intake. We've seen this before in years gone by, but not so much in recent times. They have not only split it into 4 different sections with the overhead crash structure and the T camera mount in the middle of it all, dissecting it. So that breaks up the whole intake into 4 different separate channels. But also they've been able to move some of that backwards. So the engine cover, or the top body cover, which sits a lot further back, may benefit from a better stream of air coming off the top of the halo. They've got this little winglet running around the top of the halo that we've seen lots of teams utilise, and it may be that by moving that further back we get a better flow of airflow coming off the driver's helmet and off the halo part of the car. It's a difficult section this. Now that we've introduced a halo, it's actually a slightly different way of managing that airflow than we've had over the past few years that teams have had to get their heads around, and it may be that that's their take on that solution to that problem. Wing mirrors, very kind of conventional as they are now in 2019, very wide, mounted on these two mounting brackets here. One extended out a long way, used as an aerodynamic control device. The other, which is a sort of more vertical support, again controlling airflow around the sides of the chassis. You can also see here some really nice detailed little downwashed winglets protruding from the side of the chassis. We saw those on a Ferrari. Lots of influence from Ferrari here, or shared influence between Ferrari and Sauber, Alfa Romeo, got to remember that. But these little, I think there's about 4 of these little winglets on the side here, just downwashing the airflow, coming past the front suspension here, cleaning it up. Each one with each has a separate winglet, so each one generating its own flow, its own vortex coming off the tips, separated, because if that was one continuous piece, of that scale, that large, you'd probably end up generating lift, pushing the car upwards. It's a little bit like an aeroplane wing, isn't it? If that wasn't serrated into separate pieces, you'd find it would generate some lift. So having split it up, it allows a bleed of air through the middle of each of those, but controlling the flow towards these enormous side pod inlets here, and then down towards the underfloor section of the bodywork. We'll get onto that in just a moment. Moving further back, you can also see a double rear wing mount, and we can also see from this picture that the same thing that we saw on the Haas and on the Ferrari, no surprise really, it's all sharing the same power unit, but the central exhaust tailpipe here with the 2 wastegates mounted vertically in line with each other above that main tailgate. And part of the reason of that is to, firstly, to shrink the bodywork in a more narrow fashion around it. You can tightly squeeze it in, more so than if they were either side underneath that tailpipe. But also, by raising them up, it may just be, there's a slight angle there as well, it may just be that we're able to blow some energised airflow towards the underside of the rear wing. I've talked about this being more difficult this year because the rear wing is higher, and it is, but with some clever engine mapping, it may be possible to start blowing the wastegate pipes off throttle, perhaps, on the entry into corners underneath this rear wing, and that will just help to speed up the airflow on the underside of the rear wing. Speeding it up lowers its pressure, and as the pressure of that rear wing is lowered under the underside and the ambient or higher pressure above, that pressure differential, the more you can differentiate between the pressure above and the pressure below, the better the downforce is. Higher ambient air pressure above the wing wants to pull down towards the really low pressure on the underside of the wing, and that's what generates your downforce. So the more high speed airflow you can pass on the underside of that rear wing, the lower the pressure and the more it wants to pull the car down onto the racetrack. That would be the thinking behind it. As I say though, much more difficult to achieve with the higher rear wing of 2019. This is quite a good picture, it really highlights this camo livery, which I really like. But it does make it quite hard to spot, which of course is its very intention. But we can see quite a lot of good detailed work around the bargeboard area. Like some of the bigger teams really have put a lot of effort into, lots of serrations, lots of different separate elements. Each one, they're separated because each one of those elements, and it's no accident that this is how it ends up. It ends up in this very intricate layout for very specific reasons, because each one of those elements, with its split or serration down the middle, starts to form its own vortex. Each one of those vortices then starts to combine with the vortex of the piece behind it. They're all formed in such a way that they merge together to form one really powerful vortex, which is then channeled off and brought out away by this bargeboard, away from the car, again dragging that front tyre wake away from the sensitive underfloor areas where it would really impact in a negative way on the downforce and the efficiency of the diffuser. So that's why all that's there, and lots of work you can clearly see gone into that. A nice big tall vertical strake on the side, again for controlling airflow around the side of the bodywork. Bodywork that has a reasonable undercut at the forward part of the side pod, but then comes out wider, a little bit more like the Red Bull at the front end, before then really narrowing in I don't know if you can see that, really going in very, very tight at the bit at the back. A real overhang, which forms this channel which speeds the airflow up into the rear section above the diffuser back there. You can just see the little winglet around the top of the halo. Again, just designed to clean up the airflow coming off the top of it and hopefully direct some of that towards this big intake, complex intake at the top. You can just see there that angled, that downwash wing in 1, 2, 3, 4 sections, as I talked about before. Lots of really lovely detail, lots of little details, and it's the little details that really stand out and that really make a difference when you've got a good car. Sauber, as it was last year, had a good car. At some races they had a great car. They got some great results out of it. So it's about refining, it's about, you know, and actually, as you've got to say, last year's car was an innovative car. They had lots of really great detail. I remember doing the video on last year's Sauber, being quite excited about it. And I feel the same again this year. I think they've done a great job. I'm really interested, and I really hope that all of this innovation and this detail translates into great performances. We'll find out next week to some extent. Right then, just looking at a side view, not extreme high rake like we've seen on some other cars. That of course may well change. Again, just a shakedown at this point. But we can see here the double rear wing mount, a little bit like Ferrari have got with the double wastegate above the tailpipe, as I said. Again, very high DRS actuator. Lots of similarity again from the Ferrari. Rear wing as well, many serrations in the transition phase, designed to sort of smooth out and clean up that airflow leaving the car. We can't see too much more at the moment until we get the proper pictures, and I'm really interested to see those. But I just wanted to talk you through what I think we can learn and what I think some of the thinking behind some of these concepts are, because they are different, they are innovative. The side pods, again, you can't see too much, but they've raised the side pods up very, very high, but had a sort of almost arced, you know, taking on them. The crash structure, like some of the others, has been lowered and being used for aerodynamic benefit, but instead of coming out very wide on the side pod inlet, they are sort of arced over to aid the shaping of the bodywork behind that side pod and on towards the rear, really increasing the contour, which will, in effect, aid the airflow around it, will help with that airflow following that contour as it moves towards the rear. So some of the thinking outside the box is what I really like. One of the reasons I got into Formula 1 in the very first place was because I kept seeing as a kid these weird and wonderful cars with 6 wheels or giant fans on the back. And I know we don't get innovation to that extreme level anymore because the regulations are so tight. But 2019 was going to be one of these years where the regs were so prescriptive that we might not get any differences between the car, visually at least. Alfa Romeo have just proved that that is absolutely possible. And to be honest, I hope it works for them.